Former UFC fighters are finding that the transition to Bellator isn't always an easy one, so what does that tell us about the true difference in talent between the two promotions? McJunkie columnist Ben Fowlkes and retired UFC and WEC fighter Danny Downs discuss. Folks, well, Danny, if you were thinking that you'd come out of retirement and cruise through the Bellator ranks, might be time to reconsider that strategy. On Friday night, Gegard Mousasi was the latest former UFC fighter to meet more resistance than expected in Bellator. Unlike Lorenz Larkin and Benson Henderson, he still got the win in the end, but he faced some stiff competition from Alexander Shlemenko, and the evidence was written all over his face by the end. As the sample size grows, is it time to start asking ourselves whether we've been selling the competition short in Bellator? Mousasi left the UFC on a 5-fight winning streak. If you put him in a fight with the current UFC middleweight champion, he's probably the favorite. Yet he still got all he could handle in his first fight with Bellator. As Bellator CEO Scott Coker loves to point out, people did the same with Strikeforce fighters, downplaying their skills because they weren't in the UFC. But several of them became champs once they finally made the jump to the UFC. Are we making the same mistake all over again with Bellator as the lesser-known MMA organization? If so, will we ever stop making that particular blunder? Downs, welcome to the club, Ben. Those of us who actually watch the sport of MMA instead of being a Zuffa zombie, although I guess now the Endeavor eunuchs have known about Bellator for some time. Especially considering the way the UFC roster has ballooned the last couple years, the talent gap outside the top 5 has drastically narrowed. We should be asking ourselves if we've been selling the competition short, but I wouldn't count on too many others joining the fold anytime soon. The UFC bias is too strong. In Mousasi's case, despite the fact that he's competed in every MMA organization you can think of, people will think of him as an also-ran, like he couldn't hack it in the UFC. The same holds true for Phil Davis and Ryan Bader. Even Eddie Alvarez, who became UFC champion after a successful career in Bellator, doesn't get the credit he deserves. He lost his UFC debut to Donald Cerrone, therefore Bellator is the minor leagues. Part of it is also Bellator's own doing. In an effort to deliver some name-brand fighters, the Legends Tour moniker can seem too familiar. We all love a good freak show fight, but even then Bellator is held to a different standard. If Royce Gracie vs. Ken Shamrock 3 happens inside a Rizin ring instead of a Bellator cage, I think the feelings and expectations are much different. We often talk about how the number of UFC events can make fans feel less inclined to watch. This has ramifications outside the UFC. Even though Bellator and the UFC rarely go head-to-head, there's only so much MMA you can consume. Even the hardcore fans have to go to work and occasionally bathe. Who has time for another MMA promotion? The boom period of MMA is over. Isn't it too late to catch up to the UFC now? If not, how do they gain ground? Folks, first of all, props for being the hip guy who knew Bellator was good before it was cool. Second, how do you catch the UFC from behind? Maybe you have to meet it halfway. Bellator has been slowly gaining ground on the UFC, both through its own talent acquisitions and the UFC's missteps, but there's still a ways to go. What I wonder is whether it helps that cause to see former UFC fighters struggle in the Bellator cage. On one hand, you paid good money to lure these fighters away, so you want to make your investment back. You want them to be the successful stars you thought you were paying for, right? On the other hand, if they come over and get roughed up by existing Bellator fighters, it prompts the kind of conversation we're having now. Or maybe it doesn't. Maybe some people see it as proof that the UFC was right to let that guy go. Maybe they don't even notice because Bellator just draws so much less attention to begin with. Or maybe this conversation about quality of fighters isn't one that most fans are truly interested in anymore. We used to love that argument when it was Pride vs. UFC. We loved it slightly less when it was Strikeforce vs. UFC. But could it be that the UFC brand name is so solidified at this point that a certain segment of the fan base doesn't even care if it's where the best fighters are? That'd be a little depressing, now that I'm thinking about it. But does that mean it's not true? Downs, I take it back. We don't want you in our club anymore. I bet you'd probably never pay your dues. There is something to the thought that the UFC is so ingrained as the face of MMA that it would be hard to catch it. There's something to it because I said the exact same thing earlier, and you repackaged it as your own thought. People like to make fun of the I Train UFC crowd, but there's something to the joke. The term MMA may have more traction now than ever, but there are still a huge number of fans who think UFC and MMA. Part of that has to do with the role of media. Dana White may talk about Bellator's Viacom money, but the UFC has a lot on content. In mainstream outlets like ESPN or FS1, the UFC is the MMA content. This brings us to a chicken or the egg argument. The UFC receives the most coverage because that's what fans want. But how much of that has to do with what we give them? Can you name 3 Bellator champs? How many fighters on the Bellator roster can you list as Alexander Griboyedov, a current heavyweight, or a 19th-century Russian playwright? Certainly the failure to answer those questions isn't the media's fault, but we have to wonder if fans will ever be willing or able to make up that lost ground in the information battle. Having good fights isn't enough. What that extra piece of the puzzle is, I don't know. I do know that there are only so many hours in a day, so many articles a website can write, and so much time an MMA fan can commit. Maybe fans will start to commit more of that time to Bellator. But maybe they'll find something else to do. If they do that, it won't just be bad for Coker, it'll be bad for everyone. Ben Fowlkes is McJunkie and USA Today's MMA columnist. Danny Downs, a retired UFC and WEC fighter, is a McJunkie contributor who has also written for UFC.com and UFC 360. Follow them on Twitter at @BenFowlkesMA and @DannyBoyDowns.